My name is Cali Prince, and today I am presenting a paper, The Unexpected Effects of Autoethnographic Embodied Texts and Performances. This is recorded on the 17th of November, 2021. I'd like to do an acknowledgement before I begin. I'd like to acknowledge the Darug elders, past, present, and future. I live and work on Darug country, and I wish to acknowledge all the Darug people and communities, as well as First Nations Australians across Australia. I acknowledge the artists of Western Sydney, particularly the women, including Indigenous Australian women and women of culturally diverse backgrounds. These conversations have changed the way that I see. This is where I live, on Darug country, overlooking the plains of Western Sydney. It's about an hour inland from the sea. I also want to begin with a quote by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who says there are stories within stories in her book, The Gift of Story. She also has a phrase in chapter 3 of Women Who Run with the Wolves, where she says, or calls it, nosing out the facts. And this speaks to me as a very strong metaphor for my journey in undertaking a doctorate in cultural research. I found this to be particularly true, particularly in my autoethnographic journey. I will come back to this later in this presentation. I do also want to mention that I draw quite heavily on some other metaphors by Estes. The bones, I'll share with you later a poem, Bone Poems, and the bones are a metaphor for the bone fragments of the story that were taken out. And for me as an autoethnographer, it was about retrieving the bones and bringing them together, piecing them together, and then telling that, weaving those stories together to reveal a fuller and a more whole picture. Also, her metaphor of the story of Bluebeard from Women Who Run with the Wolves, as she retells it, and this, just to distill it to its essence, is a story about a woman who has all the keys to the kingdom. So I, investigating my own practice as a arts and cultural worker in Western Sydney, I had all the keys to the kingdom, metaphorically, or to many of the keys within the institution. And in her version of Bluebeard, it really highlights that this woman who had all the keys to the kingdom, she was not allowed to open one door. She could open all the others but that one. And when she did open that door, she found dead bodies behind it, dead women. Well, this really spoke to me, and this, in my autoethnographic journey, is the metaphor I draw on, particularly in the retelling of Bone Poems, because that is in many ways metaphorically what happened to me through this story, piecing together all the bone fragments. Behind it, I found the dead bodies in this story. And we'll get to that later. But as Dr. Estes says, we must use our abilities to stand what we see and then to convey that or communicate that, take action on that. There is an ethical responsibility that I have as a practitioner to do that. So just to summarise, in my doctoral research, I undertook a qualitative inquiry intersecting arts-based research, narrative inquiry with experiments in ethnography. There's a whole array of different forms, including autoethnography, sensory ethnography, visual ethnography, ethnographically based poetry. And through this, I created a new innovation in methodology that I call sensory poetic relationship mapping. That revealed at the centre this story that had been largely pushed to the periphery, that was largely ignored, silenced, undermined, discredited, just not told in the dominant or the master narratives of this plays. And so revealing these threads of this story, bringing them together, bringing them into centre, then led to autoethnographic performance. More about my methodology and process can be read here in a recent article in Qualitative Inquiry published earlier this year. But my research was investigating collaborations, creative collaborations between artists, institutions, people and communities. And within that, I was interested in that turquoise shaded space, that overlapping in between space of transformation, where I noticed unexpected effects can occur. And I was particularly interested in working from a conceptual frame with chaos theory and looking at the non-linear effects, as well as how small effects, small changes can have significant impacts or effects. And also looking particularly at the interrelationships and those that gets looked at in sensory poetic relationship mapping in detail. So, it involved autoethnographic poetry, layering maps, sensory maps with plasticine and wool to map these relationships and processes. It changed the way that I saw myself as a practitioner and the way that I saw the work that I've been doing. While the work had a great value, there was a shadow side that came into my awareness through this process, and that led to the writing of bone poems that's published in the Ethnographic Edge, and then later a podcast and performance live on site that's now leading to an image series to accompany the poetry, which I want to read for you today. So I'm going to speed through this next bit, but for those that want to know more about the underpinning methodology, this is it. It's in Qualitative Inquiry. You can read about it there. There's many layers to in terms of methods that are overlapping, and we're not going into that today. I want to focus on this site that was illuminated through sensory poetic relationship mapping, where various different women's stories, interconnected, matched, aligned with one another, they were telling the same story about this site in Western Sydney that essentially is a site where there had been radioactive waste and material on site, and they told various different stories, but they were talking about this same site, and it's a place where I had worked. So this changed everything for me, and ethically I could not look away once it was revealed to me. And sensory poetic relationship mapping reveals it right there in that map before you. So let's just jump forward to the site that it links to. That site in Western Sydney links to a site called Woomera in Australia, which is the premier nuclear storage site. I'm just aware of time, so I'm going to just be very brief here and say this site looks like this, and it's a no-go zone where the public does not have access. But radioactive material was moved from the Western Sydney site that was illuminated by the women in their stories to me to this site. And then I went into the historical archives and documents and found those stories or pieces of that puzzle, those fragments, retrieved them with the women's stories and retold that story through me as the autoethnographer and as the researcher. And here is the site in Western Sydney, now turned a housing site, where those radioactive waste materials were housed and now have been moved to Woomera. But this is, you can buy apartments there now. It's a brand new development and it's a large development. But I began to explore in that site and turning the poem into the written text into an autoethnographic performance, which is now a podcast. So let's hear a little bit from Bone Poems now. So I'm going to read just a very short snippet from poem 5, and I'll do that now. Yeah, we'll talk more later. Poem 5, Seeping Through the Cracks. There by the living floor, it appeared in the flicker of her eyes, a woman who bought her first home. on that soil, my land rights, she said. You know, I used to look through the fence at the kangaroos and emus. Some had deformities or discoloured, or their fur was really thin. I mentioned it to the guy at the news agency shop. Quote, mate, I'm from the bush. There's something wrong with those animals. He said, love, don't you know about the site? It was the ammunition dump for the government. It's where we washed the trucks from Maralinga and it seeped into the soil. Every single bloke that I've worked with, and I'm the last one to die, we've all had some kind of cancer. He ended up dying of cancer, she said. That old fella was giving me local knowledge of that land and what it was used for, she said. Explosives, TNT, asbestos, even uranium, she said. They drove around in their cars protesting, she said. They buried ammunition there. You know, the young bloke that went exploring over there and put a trunk under his bed and his mother found it. It was full of friggin' grenades, unquote, she said. Stories passed down the street, quote, it was kids who found them in the bush, missiles, unquote, an elder from the mountain said. Quote, oh yes, there was a century gate that made munitions and missiles, unquote, a man at the cafe said. And now I'm going to fast forward to another excerpt in Bone Poems, keeping in mind it's 13 interconnected poems and it takes around half an hour for the full series of poems to be read. But let's jump into where the radioactive material that was stored at that site is revealed in the historical archives and documents. You will not hear the manager of the site alert the chain of command that the 1985 audit report identified, quote, some of the material in storage was potentially hazardous, unquote. Radioactive waste, quote, ranging from cardboard boxes and plastic bags to concrete blocks and 44-gallon drums, unquote. You will not hear that it contained, quote, some high-level sources, unquote, quote, material from atomic bomb tests, and so on. Now, I want to mention that in the development of the imagery that accompanies Bone Poems, it's been in a dialogic process with some of the key storytellers that shared their stories that went in as verbatim into Bone Poems. Now, the drafts of Bone Poems were shared with them. There were opportunities for feedback. And then with the visual imagery, I received feedback and had to drastically change it, in fact. One of the artists who was an Indigenous artist, it was originally a black and white image series, said that it needed to be in full colour. The red needed to be seen on the hands and in the red dress in full colour for a number of reasons. But this change was made. And similarly, another artist who had shared stories did not want the background obscured. She wanted to be able, it was important that the background was fully visible and not obscured. And that change was also made. So there is an ethical responsibility in working with these stories. Now, in the ongoing dialogue with these women, it is now turning into a further performance and series of poetic works. So it's just like one autoethnography in performance ethnography births another one, and so on. And so the stories multiply more stories. I don't want to go too far into this, except to say, you know, as highlighted, it's not simply a way of knowing. It is a way of being in the world. And we do have an ethical responsibility in conducting this work. And particularly what I want to look at is, as Soyeni Madison says, that it changes us. The process can change us. And not only who we are, but who we become. And that most certainly has been my experience. But I want to now jump to the final series of poems, Bone, Speak and Care. And because of economy of time, I can only share a very short part of Bone, Speak. But this is the dialogue that is unfolding and being turned into poetry with some of those bone story keepers or bone keepers who are the research participants that informed Bone Poems. So I'm just going to preface it and say that the word silence is used to replace identifying people, places, and organisations or institutions, but it's intentionally been used to highlight the ongoing censorship and silencing that continues due to the overriding power, authority, and dominance of a myriad of interconnected institutions of power. So let's begin. Poem 1, Bones Speak, with Nina Maria Cruz, Hope. Nina Maria Cruz was she who told me of the theatre project she had worked on with the women who worked at the factory on the old site and how their project was shut down. My heart is in my throat as I open her message. Quote, "It was a gut-wrenching read for me, brought back the old trauma from the theatre project with the council. Despite it, it lifted mine and Astrid's spirits. She is a very close friend who was traumatized with me then, as she also worked at that project with the Silence Theatre in silence then. The good thing you provided hope from the cracks. The day of reckoning has come. Then I believed one day an Australian person who has a big heart will discover this secret and unravel it." Poem 2, Silence. Then, quote, "Finally the butterfly effect, 91 to 1997, when there was a fight over the mother's place when they, Silence, shut down our project. The same period me and Astrid as investigative journalists simultaneously manhandled by Silence and dragged Astrid to jail, and I was thrown out to the highway when we were also doing a story about Silence arms exhibition in Silence, where purchasers, including Silence, attended to buy weapons. We were paid reporters, but that didn't matter. We knew too much about Silence and Mother's Play." Poem 3, Heart, Cry, Fly. I feel relief. Others experienced it too. Go ahead and write. Let those butterfly wings fly, sister. Thank you makes my heart cry. Unquote. Now my heart has left my throat and is in the soles of my feet. I can feel the earth breathe. I can feel a web of interconnections between us weep, unfolding new life as the bones of this story speak. Now I would like to share the concluding poem, Care, because the ethics and the relational ethics are at the heart of this work. Care. This is not only about me, but is told and performed through my body as the researcher, that in the work care is at the centre and form follows. Care is not some kind of add-on or tick box or even step at the end of the process. It is not just that you care, but for what do you care? And where do you care? And for who do you care? Why do you care? And do you put care in the centre? Thank you.